Hello and welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm going to be talking about something pretty specific, something a little bit geeky in a sense, and I hope you'll find it interesting. It's different from some of the things that we usually discuss on this channel because in this case the topic is a critique of a certain argument for the eyewitness nature of the Gospels. Now, as you know, if you watch this channel, I'm a strong advocate of the eyewitness nature of the Gospels, that they're coming maybe at one remove or two removes at most from people who were actually eyewitnesses of the events. And the argument I'm going to be discussing today is an argument for that same conclusion, and yet I'm critiquing it and critiquing the claimed evidence for it. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that the supposed evidence that I'm talking about today falls into a category, a broader category of subtle things that a narrative author is supposedly doing deliberately, but doing them in a very roundabout way. And as you know, I've critiqued that. I've critiqued it when it's against the eyewitness nature, when it's a claim, for example, that an author put a symbolic meaning in there and was making up the detail, that it's not true. I've critiqued it even when someone is saying, well, he made it up, or I'm sorry, he didn't make it up, it's real, it really happened, but he made up a symbolic meaning for it as well. And I've critiqued this kind of authors doing something super subtle on purpose, sort of across the board. And so I wanted to show, and this is the second reason, that I'm willing to do that even when the supposed subtle technique supports a conclusion that I strongly agree with. The author I will be criticizing today is Richard Bauckham, who has a really, fascinating book with a lot of great stuff in it, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And I agree with a lot of what's in that book, even though this is something that I disagree with. So, again, this is not, don't read Bauckham, definitely read Bauckham. But he has a claim that there is a certain kind of evidence for the eyewitness nature of the Gospels that he calls the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. That's his phrase. That he believes he's found in Mark, Luke, and John. He doesn't claim it in Matthew. In fact, he rejects Matthean authorship of Matthew, and that's another area where I disagree with him. But he claims that he's found it in Mark, Luke, and John. He also uses some of the more direct arguments for witness testimony, like the direct statements in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple he's the disciple that wrote this book, and he's very, very good on that. So in many cases, he and I are in agreement, but he is trying to supplement the case with this supposed device of the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. Now, I'm going to be using the phrase sometimes device or literary device here. I want to make it clear that this is not what I've elsewhere called a fact-changing literary device. But I also disagree with this one because I just don't think the evidence is there for it. Even though it's not per se a fact-changing literary device, it's still supposed to be a device in the sense that the author's doing it on purpose. In that sense, it's different from an undesigned coincidence because, of course, the whole point of an undesigned coincidence is that the author is not doing it on purpose. And so an undesigned coincidence is a subtle indication of witness testimony, but its subtlety arises from its truthfulness and from the naturalness of the narrative, and that the author is not trying to do this on purpose. Sometimes I think that scholars actually prefer things that are hidden and on purpose over things that are a little difficult to see, but that arise from that value of casualness. I'm not sure why that is, but they seem to think that's cooler. So this is going to be a slightly longer video, so if you're interested, stay with me. This is going to be a critique of the claim of the inclusio of eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. First of all, what is an inclusio? In very broad terms, an inclusio is the use of bookends, where an author is putting, in some sense, the same thing at the beginning and at the end of his document. He's bracketing it in some way. So here's a really simple and obvious example, and I think the poetic examples are really some of the best. So in Psalm 8, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Beginning. You go through, doesn't use that again, it's not a refrain, and then you get to the end, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, right? Okay, so that's an inclusio. It's poetic inclusio. He's putting these exact same words at the beginning and at the end. There are modern hymns that do that. I mean, semi-modern, where you literally sing a certain set of alleluias at the beginning and then again at the end, but not as a refrain in between the verses. And I guess you could call that an inclusio. So that's the general category of an inclusio. Now, it gets a lot more iffy when scholars start trying to claim that it's like a thematic inclusio. Well, you got this theme at the beginning and then you got this theme at the end, and that's an inclusio, because then it becomes less obvious and less clear that it's even there. And that's what I'm going to be arguing today, that it's one of those deer tracks in the woods, or a Rorschach blot or something, where you look at it and you say, oh, it looks like this to me, and it's an illusion, okay? And Bauckham is using the inclusio here in that much broader sense. What he claims is that one way that authors indicated who their eyewitness sources were was that they would deliberately put the name of an eyewitness source at the beginning, like mention it at the beginning, and then mention it at the end as well, and bookend or bracket their narrative, and that was this little, Easter egg, as young people like to call it, this little clue that person was a major witness source for the document. Now, what you have to read Bauckham's book to realize is that he has no explicit mention of this supposed device anywhere. And he doesn't claim that he does. I find that sometimes when people hear someone say, the device of telescoping, the device of compression, the device of the inclusio of eyewitness testimony, you hear somebody say that in a presentation, or you notice it briefly in a book, you then assume that this person has literally found something, saying, hey, if you want to designate your witness, do it this way. And then somebody else might have read that, done it. Somebody else might have read that and been able to recognize it, and so forth. Now, I'm not saying Bauckham's being misleading here. All you have to do is read the book to realize that, he's not claiming that he has some explicit mention. But once you realize that, then you have to say, whoa, then what is the evidence? In fact, making it even more interesting, Bauckham suggests at one point that Mark may have invented the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. Now, he doesn't really think that, but he thinks it could be. He's kind of, in the middle on it. But he brings it up as a serious suggestion. Now, think about that for a minute. If Mark invented it, how is Mark's audience supposed to recognize it? If this is the first time it's been used, are we just going to say, well, the concept of an inclusio of some kind was in the air, it was in the water, or something, and then people were supposed to pick it out, the same way that Richard Bauckham has picked it out. That gets really iffy. So to me, it's very telling that he suggests at least the possibility that Mark may have invented it to begin with. Now, he does claim that he has found it in some extra biblical sources. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those, though I have looked at the argument there and tried to call up the texts and so forth for at least two of them that he claims. And I think it's weak, but this video is going to be long enough already, so I'm only going to say a few words about it. It's really important to realize, though, that Bauckham believes that the argument from the Gospels itself is sufficient to make the case that it even existed. And that's putting a great burden on that argument. Okay, that you don't have any, if you don't have sufficient knockdown other evidence that a subtle device of this kind even existed at all, and you're going to try to make your argument from the, supposed presence of it in the Gospels be the argument that it existed. And you're going to say that that's sufficient to show not only that it's present here, but that it even existed at all. That's a really heavy burden to place on that argument. And in the case of these other documents as well, it's not, again, that they're saying, hey, this is how I'm indicating my witness sources, or this is how you indicate your witness sources. It's the same kind of thing that he's doing in the Gospels, where he's picking up, for example, the satirist Lucian's life of a charlatan named Alexander, or Porphyry's much later life of Plotinus. And he's noticing somebody named at the beginning and somebody named at the end, and then conjecturing that this person may have been the witness source and that this may be the Inclusio. So it's exactly the same kind of argument, and therefore subject to the same kinds of critiques, even though it comes from outside the Gospels. In general, I think that Bauckham doesn't recognize the tension between two of the things he's trying to bring together. And he says, explicitly emphasizes this in the second edition of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that he's looking for frequent repeated use of the person's name throughout the narrative, as well as the use at the beginning and the end. Now, right away that should ring a little bell, because when you have an undeniable inclusio, like, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name," it doesn't occur frequently in between. We would call it a refrain in poetry if it occurred frequently in between verses, like his merciful kindness endures forever, we have in some of the gospel, or some of the Psalms. And that's a refrain. So if a character is so important, or a person is so important, that you're mentioning him over and over again, like Peter in the Gospels, or Emilius in Porphyry's life of Plotinus, then it could easily just happen by chance that the person is both the first and the last disciple named, because he's just an important person in the document. So that's right away a little clue that there's a problem here, and that we may be cluing to something that isn't there at all. This supposed bookending can just come about because the person's mentioned a lot, and because the person's important. Bauckham tries to push back a little bit against that in his non-gospel examples by saying that it's contrived. I'll just give you one example. In the case of Lucian's savage, negative biography or life story of this charlatan named Alexander, at the beginning, Lucian mentions a letter where this guy Alexander compared himself to Pythagoras, the ancient mathematician. This is meant to illustrate his vanity. And Lucian says that this letter was written to Rutilianus, Alexander's son-in-law, who married his daughter. And Bauckham says, well, Rutilianus isn't going to come up in the story for a while, but he contrives to mention him at the beginning by mentioning this letter. I just don't find that contrived at all. I think that's a very weak argument. If I had an email in which someone said something that showed that he was very vain, and especially if I had the permission of the person to whom the email was written, and I wanted to say something about it, I can easily imagine saying, well, in an email that he wrote to so-and-so, he compared himself to Christopher Columbus discovering the New World, or whatever. The guy's really got a vanity, and he's showing that there. And it's just kind of natural to mention the person to whom the letter was written. So I don't agree that that's contrived, and therefore evidence that he's trying really hard to put Rutilianus at the beginning. Again, if Mark invented this, then what are we going to say? That, these pagan authors noticed it in Mark. Bauckham even sort of tries to suggest that concerning Porphyry's very positive life of Plotinus, and he says something to the effect that Porphyry may have recognized it in Mark and used it, and if Porphyry recognized it in Mark, that's more likely if it was known outside of Mark, which would give him the opportunity to know about it and recognize it in Mark, which reminds me of the old saying, if we had some ham, we could have some ham and eggs if we had some eggs. So this is kind of weak. That's all I'm going to say about the extra biblical examples, but again, it's just really important to know that Bauckham doesn't have any explicit reference to this anywhere, and the extra biblical examples are subject to the same kinds of concerns that we find in the Gospels, namely that he's seeing something that isn't really there. So I'm going to move on to the argument from the Gospels, which he thinks is really strong just in and of itself. Notice that even if it existed, for which we have very little evidence, if any, we'd still have to argue that it's found, that it's in the Gospels. And once you see the problems, I hope you will see that we don't have good evidence that it is in the Gospels. So let's go to Mark and the claim that this is found in Mark. So Bauckham's claim concerning Mark is that it is based upon the eyewitness testimony of Peter. Amen. I'm right there with him. I agree with that. And that's, of course, something that the church fathers mention, and credit to Bauckham. He takes that patristic evidence seriously. I really appreciate that. But his claim is that Mark indicates this by having Peter be the first person named and the last person named, or at least the first disciple named and the last disciple named in his gospel. One problem right away is that even when we are talking about the ministry of Jesus in Mark and Luke and John, the first person named who is connected with the public ministry of Jesus is John the Baptist. And John, even the author of the Gospel of John, even emphasizes John the Baptist, bore record, bore witness, and so forth. And in fact, it's not even impossible that certain information did come to some of the authors from John the Baptist, even as a witness in the more ordinary sense, because some of them were disciples of John the Baptist before they were disciples of Jesus. Andrew, for example. So Bauckham's just, it's kind of like, except for John the Baptist, you have to skip over it. And Mark really emphasizes John the Baptist, like, boom, right at the beginning of his document. Oh, well, except for that. All right. So Peter is called, and he is first named among the known disciples of Jesus who followed Jesus in his ministry in Mark's gospel. There's something odd here, too, though, that I have to mention about the two synoptic gospels when we're talking about Jesus' ministry. Now, Bauckham is, I think, rightly emphasizing a verse in Acts 1 where Peter himself says that they need to choose someone to replace Judas who's been witness of Jesus' ministry from the beginning. And that's the name of the chapter in Bauckham where this occurs, Witnesses from the Beginning. I think that is an important verse. And Bauckham drew my attention to a kind of undesigned coincidence, though he doesn't use that word, with Jesus talking about, you've been with me from the beginning, in the Gospel of John and the farewell discourse. So that's in their minds. And Peter emphasizes that he wants this person they eventually choose Matthias, to have been with them from the time of the baptism of John. And that's like when they consider, Jesus' ministry to begin. Okay. But Luke and Mark omit the fact that Peter himself was with Jesus from the time of the baptism of John. John's gospel tells us that. In John's gospel, Andrew is actually the first disciple mentioned. I'll get to that a little bit later. And Andrew finds Peter, his brother, and they're in Judea. John reports that early Judean ministry. It's been long noticed that the synoptics don't tell about the Judean ministry. Now, I'm not saying that means they thought it didn't occur, but notice that Bauckham is committed to quite a strong thesis, and the more you commit yourself to a strong thesis about an author's motives, the more you open yourself to a legitimate argument from silence. We have to be careful about arguments from silence, but if someone's going to make a really strong claim about motives, then there's more of a possibility of a legit argument from silence. The claim about the motives is that the gospel authors are motivated to show these witnesses as being with them from the beginning, that John the Baptist's baptism of Jesus is the beginning, and that they're trying to name Mark, in the case of Mark, Peter, and also in the case of Luke, he says Peter, as having been with Jesus from the beginning. Now, if that's their motive, and if, as Bauckham doesn't question, Peter really was with Jesus from the time of approximately the baptism of John, then why do Mark and Luke first mention Peter in Galilee, in the Galilean ministry? And Mark even narrates the call of Peter and Andrew in a way that readers could become, I believe accidentally, confused into thinking that that was the first time Jesus even saw Peter and Andrew. And some people have been confused in that way. If that was their motive, wouldn't they have said, well, now, Peter, when did you first meet Jesus? Like we would say to a married couple, where did you guys meet? It's kind of a conversational gambit. And try to find out, oh, okay, he was with him. He was really there from Judea, the time of Judea, from right after Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. I'm going to be sure to point that out because that was supposedly their motive. So I think this is a kind of an issue. Even though Peter is the first disciple or follower of Jesus, if we don't count John the Baptist, to be mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, he's first mentioned in Galilee, not from the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Okay, public ministry. But there's a much bigger problem at the end of Mark. Big problem with this claim of the Inclusio of eyewitness testimony as an indication of Peter as the source in Mark. For that claim, Bauckham emphasizes the words of the angel at the tomb at the end of Mark's gospel as we have it. He says, tell his disciples and Peter. Okay? The angel tells the women, tell Jesus' disciples and Peter. Okay? And Bauckham takes this to be the other bookend in Mark. Well, we have a question here. Is Mark, as we have it, complete? And it's interesting to me that, unless I just missed it, I can't find anywhere that Bauckham addresses this. As you know, if you've studied the issues concerning the Gospel of Mark, there's a very real question as to whether after the verse where the women flee from the tomb, that's really the end of the Gospel. Many completely, I think, respectable scholars have argued that, it didn't end there. That either we don't have the end of the Gospel of Mark, or some have argued for what's called the long ending, or the longer ending, which is found in the majority text, isn't printed in some versions of the Gospel. In the modern versions, they put that in brackets. I don't think that the longer ending is written by Mark. I could be convinced otherwise. If the longer ending is written by Mark, Mary Magdalene is the last disciple of Jesus to be named. Just say it. If the longer ending is not the ending, but the ending was lost, if Mark isn't complete, then we don't know who the last disciple was to be named in Mark. So this is a pretty big burden that Bauckham is taking on of taking it that Mark ends at verse 8, and that's a crucial premise of his argument for Mark. I mean, that's not just incidental. That's intrinsic to his argument for the Inclusio of eyewitness testimony in Mark, is that Mark never narrated appearances of Jesus, and that really is the end of the gospel, so that Peter really is the last disciple named. Once you realize that, it's like, whoa, this argument's a lot shakier than I thought. That's a big problem. All right, let's move on to Luke. Now, with Luke, what I might call delay in mentioning Peter is extremely noticeable if Luke is trying to make an inclusio for Peter, and Bauckham says that Luke is. He says that Luke is following and even in a sense hat-tipping Mark subtly by creating an inclusio for Peter, that Peter was an eyewitness source, and I think Peter was probably one of Luke's eyewitness sources, but I don't think he's showing it by this inclusio. And Bauckham even says that it's a strong confirmation of the existence of the inclusio in Mark that we have a different inclusio for Peter in Luke. I mean, you're kind of basing a shaky premise on another shaky premise at that point. One of the things that makes it very shaky in Luke is the several chapters of material before we even get to a mention of Peter. For one thing, we have the infancy narrative. Now, before you say, oh, well, except for the infancy narrative, we're talking about the public ministry. Why? Why? If we're supposedly talking about putting somebody at the beginning and putting somebody at the end of your document to show that that person's an important witness, why do we just get to go, well, except for the infancy narrative? Especially when we realize that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was still alive throughout Jesus' ministry. And Mary is pretty clearly and a lot less subtly tipped as a witness for the infancy narrative. Twice, the Gospel of Luke says that Mary kept these things and pondered them in her heart, treasured them in her heart. I mean, it's you're kind of missing the obvious for the non-obvious, and I'm not saying Bauckham rejects the idea that Jesus' mother was one of the witnesses. Bauckham emphasizes the fact that women probably were witnesses, especially that Luke is using. But the point is, okay, there's Mary. Mary is emphasized at the beginning. The first person named, I believe, is Zacharias, the, what would we say, cousin of Jesus. And we have the whole story of the birth of John the Baptist. And then we get the Annunciation to Mary and the emphasis on Mary as a witness. And in Acts 1, Luke mentions Mary again as being there at with the disciples early in the ministry of the disciples, early in the early church. So, there's all these characters, many characters mentioned at the beginning of Luke before we get a mention of Peter. But there's more. And let's even skip John the Baptist and the baptism of John. Okay, we're delaying. Even when we get to the Galilean ministry of Jesus, Luke has, let me just pick up my Bible here. In chapter 4, Luke is not in any hurry, even in the Galilean ministry, to mention Simon Peter. Chapter 4, after the temptation in the wilderness, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. This is 4:14. And we have the entire narrative of Jesus' rejection at Nazareth. Now, if Luke is trying to indicate Peter as an eyewitness by mentioning him at the beginning of his gospel, we're way into chapter 4, and he has this whole narrative that he didn't have to put in there. And if he did, and if Peter was there, which maybe he was, when Jesus was rejected at Nazareth, he could have found an opportunity to mention Peter. He went with, he went with Peter and his disciples and was teaching in Nazareth or something like that. And this is where they try to throw him off the cliff. Okay, and we have Jesus preaching, and they're angry, and then we also have the narrative of healing the man possessed by demons in the temple, And the report about him, and he's preaching all over the place, and the report about him was getting out into every locality in the surrounding district. Finally, in Luke 4:38, he arose and left the synagogue and entered Simon's home. Finally, Peter mentions Simon. I'm sorry, but this just does not look like an author who is trying to put Simon Peter at the beginning, even of his narrative of Jesus' public ministry, to indicate him as a witness source by putting him at the beginning and putting him at the end. He could have found some way of mentioning Peter earlier if he wanted to do that, but he keeps, putting all this other stuff in there, and then finally we get around to Simon Peter. So I just think that the argument for an inclusio involving Peter in Luke is extremely weak. And if we go to the end, we find that, in fact, Simon is the last person mentioned. So finally, we get a place where, okay, he is the last person mentioned in Luke, where the disciples from Emmaus, they return to Jerusalem to say, they've seen Jesus, he's risen. And it says when they got there, the others said, Jesus is risen and has appeared to Simon. Okay, finally we got an actual, one bookend, but what's one bookend without the beginning bookend? Let me also mention there's a little issue concerning explaining away here. Now, I said at the beginning that this alleged device of the inclusio of eyewitness testimony is not a fact-changing device, and it isn't. However, there's a little tension because if they really said that to them when they returned, and Luke heard that they said that to them, and he's recording it because they said that to them, that would very naturally come toward the end of his own gospel. And similarly, to go back a little bit to the angel speaking to the women in Mark, if the angel really said, tell his disciples and Peter, then that would come at least toward the end of the gospel, because the resurrection comes toward the end of the gospel. So Bauckham doesn't address this, and he doesn't say that the authors made it up. But some of the striking nature of it, like tell his disciples and Peter, or Jesus is risen and has appeared to Simon, kind of goes poof if the authors really are just reporting a kind of interesting, striking saying that was really made at that point in the story. Okay, that's Luke. Oh, another thing I want to mention. Bauckham says there is an inclusio within an inclusio in Luke. Now, again, I want to be careful here. When Bauckham says that the women in this inclusio within an inclusio were witness testimony for Luke, I think they were. I think that conclusion is true. And I also think with Bauckham that the naming of women who were at the tomb and went to the tomb and saw Jesus and that kind of thing in the Gospels is a way of indicating that those women were witnesses. Luke does this, and John does this, Mark does this, Matthew does this. So I agree with him there. But I don't think there's an inclusio within an inclusio. So Luke mentions Joanna, the wife of Chuza, I've mentioned her a lot, Susanna, Mary Magdalene, in Luke 8. And then these are the women. These are women who knew Jesus in Galilee. And once again, Bauckham had sort of inspired me here to think of an undesigned coincidence here that later the angel says, and Bauckham emphasizes, remember he said to you while he was in Galilee. I think the angel really said that, and I think the women really were with him in Galilee, and it says they remembered his words. So there's a lot here to agree with between me and Bauckham. But he's going beyond that, and he's saying that when Luke mentions those women in Luke 8, and then when again he mentions some of those women, not exactly the same, in Luke 24, this is an inclusio. He's bracketing material. But he doesn't mention them in between, so Bauckham's other requirement that they be mentioned often throughout is not met. But moreover, it's just not very plausible that they're sort of star witnesses for a lot of that material in between Luke 8 and Luke 24. In between Luke 8 and Luke 24, from around Luke 9:51 to somewhere in the teens, We get what's sometimes called the central section of Luke, sometimes called the travel section. It includes a lot of sayings material where I think Luke just didn't know when Jesus said it. A lot of sayings material where it explicitly says he said it to his disciples. It's just kind of a lot of material chunked in that may be even what I've called achronological. It may not have even been something that occurred at a particular time or that Luke's indicating at a particular time. So it's not very plausible that the women were star witnesses for like a lot of, most of that material in between there. Maybe for some of it. I think Luke interviewed quite a few people. And Luke does emphasize the role of women, but the Inclusio is supposed to indicate that this person was, with the chief character like Jesus, and is able to, testify to at least most of the material in between. That's how I understand the role of it. And I think that's really pushing it for this to be an Inclusio within an Inclusio. Okay, so John. Now let's go to John. This gets really, really strained for the beginning in John. So in John, Bauckham says, and I agree, that the beloved disciple is the chief witness. Absolutely. Again, amen. That's indicated in these really obvious ways, which Bauckham also takes seriously, and good for him. But of course, if it's indicated in these obvious ways, it's not clear why John needs to, go out of his way to do it in this roundabout way as well. Let's just take the obvious ways and assume that that's how he indicated his witnesses. Because, the author says in John 19, he who saw it bore record. And at the end, it says, this is the disciple who wrote these things, and his record is true. John 21:24, I believe, referring to the beloved disciple. Now, Bauckham and I have a disagreement because I think that that's John, the son of Zebedee, and he thinks that's a different John. But we both agree that the beloved disciple is sort of the star witness here. Okay, if that's indicated by an Inclusio, is he the first disciple named? Well, once again, we have the John the Baptist issue. I've already talked about that. Fine. Is he even the first disciple of among those who then went on to follow Jesus named? No. Let me read a few verses from John 1. Okay. We're past John the Baptist material. John the Baptist says, behold the Lamb of God. Okay. And he actually says it twice. John 1:35. Again the next day, John was standing, and two of his disciples. Notice that it just says two of his disciples. It doesn't say, one of them before the other. It's just two of his disciples. And he looked upon Jesus as he walked and said, behold the Lamb of God. And the two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. And then it goes on, and Jesus asks them what they're seeking, and they go with him, and so forth. Then we go down, verse 40. One of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. So the first of the 12 and the first of Jesus' main disciples to be named in the gospel is Andrew. It's not the beloved disciple. But Bauckham thinks that the beloved disciple was the other disciple who isn't named when it just says the two, okay, with Andrew. Maybe so, maybe not. I'm not convinced. It doesn't even use the phrase the other disciple, which is sometimes used for him, like in the Passion narrative, he's called the other disciple. Bauckham says, well, he couldn't call him the disciple whom Jesus loved because Jesus is only just now meeting him. He probably could have found some way to do that, but he doesn't even say, and the other disciple and Andrew followed him or something like that. He doesn't even contrive to separate him out. It just says two of his disciples. And then the first one it names is Andrew. So it's really ad hoc to try to say that there's an inclusio involving this unnamed disciple who's with Andrew when he isn't picked out by any designation whatsoever. And Andrew is in fact the first disciple who's picked out and mentioned and made the subject of a sentence, okay, in his own right. You're just going to say, oh, well, he couldn't do it because he didn't have a good way to refer to himself, but he kind of places himself there subtly. I'm sorry, if it's that subtle, then, and if the author didn't leave himself any way to do this in any other way, then it's too subtle for people to pick up on. I mean, if you don't leave yourself any way of indicating something, then you don't leave yourself any way of indicating something. And then we're not justified in claiming that it's there. So the idea of the beloved disciple as the first disciple mentioned in John's gospel, I mean, it's just not true. If he even was that person, he's first mentioned just as there were two disciples as part of this group of two. And then Andrew is the first one named. So that is just really, really a problem there at the beginning. Now, he tries to bolster the argument by using some language, some terminology. So it says that the disciples remained, for example, well, first it says they followed him. They followed him, following. And then at the end, it says that Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them when they're walking in John 21. See, follow. I'm sorry if that's really what happened in the narrative. The word follow is not that significant. And then he has another word. It says that they remained with him that day in John 1. It mentions the time and then says they stayed with him for the rest of that day. And then at the end of the gospel, Jesus says, if I will that this disciple, speaking of the beloved disciple, remain until I come, what is that to you? Remain. Again, I think this is very weak. If Jesus said that, the word remain is not some weird word. It means completely different things in the different cases. One, it's referring to, kind of a hypothetical, his living long, and in the other case, it's referring just to them hanging out with Jesus that day. And it's just a very natural word to use for the meanings. It does very little to bolster this argument for an inclusio using the beloved disciple. I think we're just really getting strained at this point. Now, once again, there's a lot to like in Richard Bauckham's book. I'm going to be trying to remember to link in the show notes a 2-part review I did of the book based on the first edition some years ago, and I still think it's a pretty good review, kind of pros and cons of the book. So I'm not just bashing the book, but I don't think this argument works for eyewitness testimony in Mark, Luke, and John. I think it's important when we're arguing for a true conclusion not to rely on shaky arguments. So that's one of my motives in doing this. I would actually urge you not to use this argument. But if you want to mention it, I would strongly urge you at least to qualify it, to say now the scholar Richard Bauckham has argued for something that he calls the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. It's not clear whether this was an actual device that people would have noticed and used. He's got an argument for it. That argument has some criticisms that can be made against it, but it may be there. If that's something you want to do, but I think you should be careful to qualify it. Above all, I would urge you not to refer to it with great confidence, and then there's the inclusio of eyewitness testimony, which Richard Bauckham has found, that use of the and found that we hear people using, because if you do that, what you're going to be doing is contributing to this ongoing notion that there's just a knockdown argument for this. and then other people they'll pick up. People are really quick to pick up on those kinds of implicatures of the manner in which something is referred to, and then to just pass them on. So if you're an apologist, you're a speaker, you're a New Testament scholar yourself, and you go out there and with your credibility that you have, you say, Richard Bauckham has found the Inclusio of eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. People are going to think you've checked it out on your own and that your credibility is being put behind the idea that this really is there. And you want to be careful not to do that. If you've seen this video, you know that there are legitimate questions that can be raised about this. And so then you want to be very careful about how you use your authority as you go on and argue for the Gospels. This is the kind of thing we're trying to do here, even when it's an argument for a conclusion that we favor and that I favor. I try to analyze rigorously and to question if something is too strong of a claim that the evidence cannot hold up and that the evidence cannot bear. That's the kind of thing we're doing here at the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous. Please be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. You really don't want to miss this content as I make more of it. So I hope you'll come back next time. Thanks.